There was an amazing moment in your book where you're talking about, I don't remember exactly at that point, but like you've talked about like the 6x9 project at this point, where people can experience being incarcerated, as well as, these sort of virtual, I mean, I'm dying thinking about the phrase that just came out of your mouth before, the virtual homelessness team building project. But then you're like, you're talking about like, have you ever noticed that there isn't the like, and now you get to be the CEO and you go golfing with all of like your
right? Like you do, but
sure. I mean, that's like what I mean. White
it's
Lotus,
Golf
Succession,
Plus, where you can play on like the world stage of the best golf courses in the world. So there are experiences that let you have those things. Like there are race car experiences,
sure,
but it's never embodied as another person. It's always
right.
imagine yourself at this thing instead of be this other person experiencing this horrible thing.
Well, you're not trying to cultivate. One is never trying to cultivate empathy when one is trying to be in that space of the CEO, or right? I mean,
are we not? I mean, I don't know. Maybe.
I guess I would think it was like desire or aspiration that's being, temporarily like fulfilled, as opposed to like the fantasy of.
It is. Yeah. But I think this is sort of like the weird thing with empathy. When you do that, when you're stuck in your fantasy, you're forced to objectify yourself and say, oh, I am lacking these things. Yeah. I have to jump into this virtual experience to experience them because there's something about me that is suffering without them.
Yeah.
And this like weird facsimile experience is as close as I'm going to get. So I'm going to put all of my time, effort, and money into doing these things.
Yeah.
And that's sort of like one of the jumping off points for virtual reality. It's why there are so many shooters. People are like, yeah, I'm going to be in this war zone. Look at these cool things I've made to make it feel like my little joystick is actually a gun. And they devote so much time to doing this. Like I'm on a ton of subreddits for VR, and somebody posted something where they were like, I'm really angry and I just need to kill people. What experience is going to give me the best, most realistic thing of that? And I'm just like, this is, what are we doing to ourselves and how are we thinking of ourselves if our experience is so at this point predicated on seeing ourselves as not enough and not able to contain these things unless we can jump into this fantasy.
Yeah.
So part of it is like the same dichotomy of here is the other over here, and they are worse than me.
Right.
So that makes me feel good. I will step into their experience. I will get it. I will grow from them. And then the other side of it is, but then there are the people who make me suffer because they have more than me. I am a being of suffering and people need to understand and watch my expression of my suffering. And this diversion is the thing that will let me do it. So let's make it as realistic as possible. And that's sort of like both sides are empathy, but we tend to not think of how we don't allow ourselves to be a being that suffers or processes our own suffering.
There's, I'm as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking too, back to that, like, it feels like something from like an early aughts. I'm thinking like not like Donnie Darko so much as like Southland Tales kind of Gonzo, like the idea of like you put on a headset and then you get to feel that you're being victimized by someone powerful. Thinking specifically though about the frat rape simulator, like imagining people choosing to do that and creating this and seeing it as an experience that's uplifting, while at the same time, like Brett Kavanaugh is being appointed to the Supreme Court, and people who have been actually victimized by him are literally voicing their own experience in this way, and somehow that's not processing that is somehow too uncomfortable. So we'd rather go through the experience of just being made to feel uncomfortable while wearing this helmet. There's something so perverse seems like the word, but not necessarily like in a trope like sexually bad sense, right? But like just it's so twisted somehow.
I don't know if there is a sexual sense. I think there is a perverse sense. And I think the takeaway that I often get when people talk about going through those experiences is the impact doesn't last. And the message that it gives is it's easy to survive this.
Yeah.
And feeling this way temporarily is really all this thing was about. And that you're still holding on to this means that somehow you are less than, or you are broken, or you are not capable.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am really delighted to introduce Dr. Jade E. Davis. Dr. Davis is a media ecologist who holds a doctorate in communication studies with a specialization in digital media and culture from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She also holds a master's in French studies from NYU's Institute of French Studies and a BA in French from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And we are really excited to talk to her about the vexed concept of empathy and her wonderful recent book, The Other Side of Empathy, which delves into how 21st century knowledge production and information, when put into practice, contribute to more nuanced and inclusive scholarly practices. Welcome, Jade. Thank you so much for making the time to talk with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
We're all so excited, and I personally am really excited. And I should say, just for the benefit of our audience and with them in mind, just to encourage people to seek out your work. This book is fantastic, and we're going to, I think, see why they should everybody buy this book. We'll get into that shortly. But also, it just you and I go back several years now via the internet and various like panels and in-person stuff. And I want to encourage people to check out your writing online, whether your social media stuff or the public talks that you've given. They're available on YouTube or your website, and just
I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah. Brilliant is not all is it's an overused word, but there's something about this idea of like the illumination of different concepts that like cut across various boundaries or ways in which like you're taught to think certain things, or you think that some things are sort of given and you don't examine them. And then, well, one recurrent experience I've had with your work in particular, and I think this is as someone who's been seen you do things on video, but also has had the rare and lucky experience, which I encourage other people to partake if they can, of seeing you give a talk, is that the way in which you work through multiple media, the way in which you work through different concepts, and it's a sort of comes together as this gestalt where stuff is connected and things are illuminated, but also it's impossible not to feel implicated and to feel many different ambivalent things about some of the concepts. So I really enjoy feeling uncomfortable and thinking about things that make me feel uncomfortable. And I think a lot of people who are shining up for this do that too. So with that in mind, I really want to just set people on to following your work in general, because that's a feeling that is productive and hits hard a lot when it comes to you.
I appreciate it, because I feel like the subtitle of the book should have been "This Book Will Make You Uncomfortable." The most I could do was get like the perfect cover image, which I'm so happy with the cover because it's so perfect. But yeah, this work will probably make you uncomfortable, but hopefully in a productive way. And if it's too much, you are free to walk away. But at least give me a couple of minutes to talk through it before you step away, so it's at the back of your head somewhere.
So let's get into it. I want to ask you about empathy, but also, Fanon is such a figure that looms large here. I also see you very much in conversation with like the field of affect theory, and I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how you came to psychoanalytic thinking, affect theory, related fields, and then what brought you to set into question this concept of empathy, which so many of us take for granted as just like, yeah, that's a good thing. We should have more of it.
That's a big question. I think the starting point for most things for me is when we think about theory, we often think about it as a way to reproduce a scientific method when it comes to understanding humanity. But there are so many things that end up outside of theory, and so many people are just excluded from being canonical theoretical thinkers. And for me, Fanon is really one of those people where I had been doing all of this work. I had gone through a master's degree. We sort of touched on Fanon, but he's not central to the French theory part. And I wasn't able to actually take a Fanon course until I was in my PhD, and that was in geography. It's with a critical geographer. And I think that that is a really sad thing, because so much theory is influenced by psychoanalysis, especially French theory. That's clearly my academic background. But Fanon is left out in the same way that Derrida is never talked about, as though he is from North Africa, and that influences how he understands France. And so Fanon becomes this person that says, I've done all the studying. I've done everything I need to do to be a French psychoanalyst. I am in the French army. I am proud of my Frenchness. I'm going to go to this place where France is doing this great stuff. And he goes, this thing that I thought was a little bit broken for me in France. So I've written this weird thesis that didn't get accepted called Black Skin, White Masks. This actually doesn't work. And I need to figure it out. And he does all of this amazing writing to try to give this blueprint for how we might do things differently if we just start with understanding that everybody is human and everybody is suffering because there's this ideal human that we're all striving to be, and nobody can get there. And freedom is really understanding that by being more on the margins, I have less investment in needing that to be real and I can do something different. And because of that, all of the psychoanalysis stuff is broken. And let me illuminate what that looks like. And nobody reads him. And I was so mad when I took the geography course because he died really young. He was in his 30s. He literally wrote 4 books. Everybody reads part of one. And it's like, you can read all of Fanon in 2 weeks. And it will blow your mind. And you will see that these books are actually supposed to be in conversation together. So, like, Black Skin, White Masks is a description, and Wretched of the Earth is how do we fix this? But we take Wretched of the Earth as though it's violence without reading the first part of Black Skin, White Masks, which says that our inability to see love when we look at ourselves first, and then see that everybody else is missing this love too, is where the breakdown starts. And that gets lost completely. And so for me, Fanon is just one of those people that allows me to talk about the same things, but differently. And it's a reminder that the canonical things that move forward will throw that away.
Yeah.
And I think empathy has a similar trajectory. I think I came to asking questions of empathy from a very young age only because I really, really get uncomfortable with experiences where people just sort of shut down and everybody does the same thing. So I talk about going to movies when I was a kid, like 3 years old, getting taken to cartoons and remembering just like looking in the audience and being like, what is happening? And sort of being obsessed with there being one light source that's getting bigger and everybody's responding in the same way. That inherently makes me uncomfortable. And I've often lived in spaces where I am the only Black person. And I have a similar experience there where people are reacting to me in a very specific way because they're making assumptions about me. And that's never not been my life. Getting into undergrad, I was always waiting for the point where I would see people who look like me in the research. And the first one is Saartjie Baartman.
Oof.
And that is like grotesque in human zoos. Like,
Yeah.
what?
Mm-hmm.
What? Why can't she just be a person? And so I've always been sort of like, I don't think empathy is quite working the way that people think that it is, because it feels similar to code switching, but like in my brain. And it's also this thing where people are trying to connect with me around suffering that they imagine because they've been told, because you are in this body, all of these things must be true about you. And so I know how to respond to you. I know the places where we can connect. So I get my whole life I've gotten stories from people who are like, oh my gosh, you're so smart. This is so amazing. And you're going to do so much. And I'm like, I'm like, my great grandparents met at teachers college at Columbia. And everybody's been really educated. And I'm sort of like the lazy learner in my family. And nobody's really expecting anything of me in that way once I decided I wasn't going to be a medical doctor. And I think that that's a really like, people are like, what are you talking about? I'm like, I'll give you an example of when my first week in grad school. There was a person who was a year ahead of me. And I had 2 children at that point, which was great because I was like, I'm not really into doing social stuff. I will be very honest about that. And I was like, I will go do a couple of things. And I went out to drinks. And he came up to the bar and he's like, I'm so glad, your cohort has so many, it's so diverse, it's amazing. And I think we have so much in common. I grew up really poor on a farm and my family made $14,000 a year. And I was like, that's great. It's like, oh, that's wonderful. I don't know what to do with that information because I can't relate to that experience. And oftentimes when people would talk to me, they would assume and I think they probably still do, that I'm like the first generation person to have a big degree in my family. And I'm like, no, no, I'm actually like the screw off because when my grandmother was alive and we would talk about my PhD and I would talk about the chair as technology, she'd be like, Jade, this sounds so useless. I don't understand what's happening. Like, why does this matter? And why do people care? I don't understand your degree. I'm glad that you're happy, but this is so dumb because her family, they were in education. Like, it was always, this is a practical skill set. And so empathy is one of these tools that sort of ends up framing people who get like colored by oppression or colored by suffering in a particular way.
Yeah.
And it erases their lived experiences. And also, empathy just is not, it's not real. In as much as it's not an innate human thing, it is a culturally learned thing that we do. It's why people offer trainings on it. There's a huge industry around it. We always hear things about cultivate more empathy or learn how
Yeah.
empathy can impact how you exist in your workplace, because it's a pattern of behaviors and not an actual thing. And similar to Fanon, it's one of those things where when it like bubbles up in the German aesthetic movement and quickly jumps to people, you immediately have somebody, Edith Stein, who everybody should read, who says this isn't good. It's actually really bad and sort of scary. So Edith Stein was Husserl's student. Her thesis is it's against empathy. She was also his TA, and she gets erased.
Yep.
And a lot of her work influenced his work because she was in there editing all of his stuff and talking to him about it.
I've never heard her
She couldn't
name.
teach because she was a woman. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I suggest everybody read her because immediately there was a person in phenomenology that said, we are taking things too far. This is actually not good. Eventually, she becomes a nun. She gets killed in the Holocaust. And it's a whole thing because she's like, everybody's doing too much. And she turns to mysticism, which I think you'll
Mm.
find a theme in the theorists that I like. They start veering towards mysticism because they're like, none of this is working. But there's something transcendental that we have to believe it if we want to function.
Yeah.
And she is one of those people. And I think empathy is this idea that starts at a weird point in colonization and just sort of grows in little spurts here and there before eventually becoming this thing that we have today, which is a whole industry around trying to make sure that we are empathetic beings, because otherwise we are psychopaths or neurospicy in a non-positive way.
So, so I want our listeners to be able to like get a handle on, pretty early on in this conversation on your critique of empathy. I think we can do that in a couple of ways, but I wanted to ask, so you start the book by listing like a variety of things that people tend to associate with, or as you point out, are taught to feel about empathy. And when you put them all together, it's actually like quite a lot of seeming contradictions and the weight of so many narrative expectations. So I was going to ask if you can speak to these, and especially to how they get recruited into what you call empathy culture. And it might be helpful for our listeners also, even as we're trying to flesh out, like, what is this thing called empathy that you're getting at? To start with a kind of, as all our examples are on this podcast, overdetermined example, possibly the 6x9 project, so that we can walk our listeners
Can
through.
I talk about a different project that I think
Yeah.
probably does a
Whatever you
better
want.
job of illustrating it?
Absolutely.
I had to rewrite the introduction, so it didn't make it into the book,
Okay.
which is fine because it was too personal. So there is a VR movie company that was one of the early pioneers called Verse. It's VRSE. They produced a lot of the early videos that got a lot of acclaim. They partnered with the UN on a whole bunch of videos, and all of the videos happened to feature women of color, more or less, like in refugee camps, and Waves of Grace happened following the Ebola epidemic. Lisa Nakamura has written an article talking about a lot of those early experiences. So I would suggest everybody check out her article. But Waves of Grace basically follows a woman named DeConte Davis. It starts at a beach, and she talks to God as though she is giving a prayer about everything that she experienced through Ebola, getting it, her family getting it. And at one point, they do this really horrific thing where she talks about being so sick that she ends up in the quarantine hospital.
Mm.
And it is dark and nobody's in there. And from the other room, she hears her family member screaming in agony. And it is this awful effective manipulation, because I don't know how else to talk about it, where you have this person talking to God and you get to this point where you hear all of the experiences and you are in there as her, hearing her prayer, hearing about her, talking about the family. And then it keeps going and they show the bodies getting dumped into the trenches that are wrapped in the white tarp. And it ends with children laughing, because the takeaway is that because she survived Ebola, and I'm pretty sure her child survived, but her husband didn't, she suddenly is able to be with the Ebola orphans and work with the sick Ebola kids because she had the illness. And this is the extent of how she gets to exist with Ebola. I The reason why this was so important to me, but it didn't make it into the book, which is fine, it's for the best, is there was another Ebola story that was much bigger and made national press and moved somebody's career forward. And that was Dr. Craig Spencer, who contracted Ebola, ran around New York, and they did all of these stories with maps of where he'd been. They documented his quarantine across the news. There were all these stories about how we need to feel better about how we think about him running around with Ebola when everybody's scared about it. It ended up being him talking about it like this was like a public health service to show that we don't need to be scared of it. And he wrote an article for the big medical journal with the name that I can't remember right off the top of my head. But there's a short article about his experience that he was able to write. And that is so different to how we are supposed to feel about DeConte. I have no ill feelings towards Craig Spencer. He became very active again at the beginning of COVID because he was in the emergency room in New York during the surge. And he was sort of like the voice talking about what was actually happening on the ground. But for me, that experience sort of showed how empathy sets us up right from the beginning to only be able to see people in particular ways and to reduce them in that way and to think through their experience in that way. That a mother who lost her husband and was scared to lose her son gets delegated to this person who can only talk to God. And we can only understand if we actually see that experience as though we are our first person thing. And that experience is the equivalent of bodies being dropped in the trenches. And that experience means that her suffering allowed her to grow in a way where she gets to help children versus I had this experience, I'm a survivor, I'm stronger, I am the expert now, is exactly what empathy does. It sort of does this weird crush into only suffering. You are somehow, it's like a weird rethinking of the noble savage in some ways, where this thing that makes you different, it doesn't actually make you different. She had the exact same Ebola experience as him. She just happened to be at a place where she couldn't leave Ebola, so she had to make do. He chose to come back to the United States after being exposed, so he had access to the best medicine. And the victory story, because they are both victory stories, do not allow her to be anything other than the Ebola survivor. Whereas he is a savior now. But that was predetermined because she was a Black woman and he was a doctor from America who happened to be working in a place that needed him.
We're recording this over Zoom, so people who are listening to this can't see this, but my face is getting progressively redder and redder with this particular type of rage that I get.
I actually was noticing that you.
This is just as an aside, Jade, is there any chance that you were raised Catholic? Is this a possibility? Were you Catholic, or are you?
No. I was not raised Catholic. Okay. I was raised completely outside of religion. Okay. So it was always like an outsider fascination. Like, what does it mean to have this level of certainty? This is amazing. I feel so like, why was I abused in this way that I don't have this level of certainty about life?
I mean, the reason I'm thinking about this is like part of my I was raised Catholic. I don't believe in any of that anymore. Like for me, one of the weird experiences of like watching people do things as a group and then being like, this is actually incredibly creepy was everyone in our parish like saying the creed at the same time. And I stopped saying it once and I had to listen to everyone else saying it. And I'm like, wow, a whole lot of people talking about like the Holy Ghost and shit in different it's creepy. It was
I thought that way about
uncomfortable.
the Pledge of Allegiance. I stopped that in 3rd grade. I was like, "This is weird. What
Yep.
is happening?
Yeah.
Why are we all doing this to him?"
The second, the two other things, right? So what I'm reaching for is like, I don't believe in God, right? But there's some part of me and that like is very grew up thinking about things with that kind of like those like architectonics, right? And so when I hear this like description of a human creation that exists to both like exemplify and narrativize but set apart a certain type of suffering for commodification but then plugs it back into narratives that kind of maintain inequality and produce that suffering, the immediate word that like comes to my mind is like satanic, right? It's in the same way like I think about perversion. It's like the perverse demiurge like creating something that seems to be a connection but actually enforces a break or maintains separation. Like
Yeah.
it's demoniac in some way. I don't know, but and this is just a random aside, but it's also bears upon these questions of like the axes on which we identify people. And there are two things I'm going to say. The first one was like the Edith Stein thing. You unlocked a memory for me of doing a graduate student course in Husserl. Like I love phenomenology. I did really good phenomenologist. He was really, really great who taught it. And part of his whole thing was working with Husserl's manuscripts, which apparently are written. He was like complaining about how they were written in this like Viennese Austrian 1920s longhand, right? So he had to learn this system to decode this shit. And he was like, it's really, no one else uses it. It was only used for about 10 years. And of course, Edith Stein had to do everything in these notes. And he kept on referring to Edith Stein as long suffering for having worked through these notes. And meanwhile, I'm just thinking, I'm like, wait, she died in Auschwitz. Like the question of like the axis along which she is suffering is not necessarily the same of like you as the tenured professor doing the research in these documents that break your brain.
And she was having like a weird crisis of faith her entire life. Like it's yeah.
And the second thing I just want, this is I'm not sure when this will air, but the person we talked to earlier this week was Stephen Thrasher, right? Who's this book about COVID, and one of the things he takes real exception to, right, is the idea of like the patient zero type, sort of like the way that stigmatizes and produces. Essentially, we look at a certain person, we abject them, and we plug them into narratives, right? But another bit in his book that seems very germane here is he close reads that scene, the famous Bill Clinton "I feel your pain" thing, right, where he's confronted with the ACT UP activist who is literally dying, being like, I'm dying, like speak to what I need, and Bill Clinton's basically like, I feel your pain. Now shut the fuck up.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, do you though? Are you actually dying right now? Because I'm definitely you're dying.
Yeah, but no, it was a really. I was thinking about that also as I was reading your book because I mean, I'm thinking. I didn't go to satanic, Patrick, or demoniac, which maybe speaks to our different upbringings. But I was thinking, the word that comes to mind over and over as I'm thinking with your book about like what empathy does is flattening, right? And it's not just a sort of like, well, it keeps the other. It's like it flattens the other into the self, right? And there you are, right back where you started, but with a belief that is not where you are.
Right. And so that's sort of the problem that I try to outline in the book without getting too into the weeds with it. The basic problem with empathy for me, like the starting point, why it's like a horrible cultural framework, is that it is dependent on biases not existing to work. And we have all of this work for decades and decades. Going back to Fanon, he critiqued the earlier version of implicit bias a long time ago. We know that that's a real thing. So to expect humans who like categorizing it, it's fun. We have tons of phone games that just let us put things into categories because we get a sense of enjoyment out of finding patterns and doing that. So if you have a framework for making the world better that requires you to see other people as the same as you, it's obviously going to fail. It just is. And the other thing, and this is sort of, I've already mentioned, I have a slight obsession with mysticism. Um, The idea that the entire universe can exist in a human is fine. I'm cool with that. That's great. But we have to understand that that's limited. And empathy doesn't explicitly say that, but it makes the assumption that somewhere in you, you have the capacity to understand every single human experience, especially the really bad ones. That's terrible. Like, I'm fine. Yes, life is suffering. Cool. We can go with that. Everybody suffers. Your suffering and the intensity that you feel of it, I'm not going to challenge you on that. My goal is to just accept that you're suffering and deal with that. But if you think you can understand my suffering, and I think that we can do this thing where we're exchanging brains somehow,
Right.
that is completely against everything because we don't even keep language that allows us to speak to each other about bad things. Like multi-generational trauma is often framed by this loss of language,
Yeah.
and empathy tries to cut out language and it goes to affect. And that's icky. That's really icky. Emotions are a mess. And we don't all respond in the way that people expect us to respond. And part of what empathy culture does is it says that there is a right way to suffer
Yeah.
and there is a way that suffering needs to look. And if you are going through trauma, this is the response you should have. And if somehow what you're doing is outside of that, then you should work on that, even if you were the one who experienced it.
Right. Right.
So it goes back to the person who tries to connect with me because he grew up on a farm making $14,000 a year.
Mhm.
I'm not correct. I'm not connecting with the right version of Blackness for him in that moment. And that becomes a how dare you be any other way? And so part of the work of the book is highlighting that we create these weird binaries. We don't acknowledge them. We don't talk about where they start. And that is why Waves of Grace is so great because there's a Craig Spencer counterpoint where we can see the very different trajectory of the same story. When people have access to different levels of power and different assumptions about who they are as a person just because of the body they exist in and the experiences they've had. We have that and we just accept it. And yeah. So the book is trying to show that we should make our understanding of those two stories more nuanced
Yeah.
so that we see the points where they are actually the exact same story
Mhm.
and our reaction to it is the cultural part. And that's the part that we should change and maybe work on doing better.
So I want us to get into this idea of empathy culture, but I want us to do because it's a wonderful book. It is a really complicated book also, and I mean that as a good thing. But I think I would like to ask you to do a little bit of ground clearing for our listeners, specifically in terms of historicizing the word empathy in some of the different modes that it's been articulated that are important for your argument. If you could tell us a little bit about its origins in European philosophical aesthetics and psychology, and speak also to something that seems very important in the book, the ways that, as you've already alluded to, we tend to either elide or sometimes distinguish rigidly between the cognitive and epistemological aspects.
We'll try to do this coherently. Please ask if anything is confusing. I get real bad with names, and this will be a rough timeline because we have limited time. But basically, empathy starts, I'm not good with German pronunciations, but if you look up the German for empathy, you'll find the word. And also Edith Stein, please go back and read her dissertation. But it starts with German aesthetics as a way to talk about the experience people are having with works of art. And in my experience, at least when people start talking about emotions, they go, oh, well, I have emotion towards people too. So maybe this is about people. So it very quickly tries to do a jump with phenomenology to become this space of understanding people. And Edith Stein, wonderful woman, everybody should read, quickly says, no, don't do this, please. This feels like it's going to go very, very badly. And it sort of takes a break and it pops up again in the United States as a way to try to figure out how we talk about imagination. And that sort of fizzles out, but it makes a resurgence in a weird way, post World War II with one of the very common names that comes up when you're talking about psychology related things, Carl Rogers. There is an article, I have a zine called Empathy as an Ideology that people can get online. There's a link on my website. I have a little thing about him there. And there was a guy that I think was waiting to write this big article about Carl Rogers and the weird stuff he was doing in like the 50s time span, which involved like doing things with drugs and feeling into fences. There's a story in this collection about that. But one of the things that happens with Carl Rogers, because again, you'll see this as a theme, is he had a woman patient who was super smart. And he found himself over connecting with her in this empathy way. And he would go out into like the lounge with his colleagues, and they thought she was one of his students. And at one point, he realized maybe she's smarter than me. And the guy talks about him literally having a breakdown and needing to take a leave and realizing that maybe empathy isn't a good thing. And by then it's too late because he's already like this big deal guy who's determining like how things are going to work. And empathy is built into this time frame when we also end up with the imagery of like the couch and psychoanalysis is this popular thing and everybody's talking about it. And empathy is there and it sort of doesn't go away. But people start doing things to like, I don't know when it took its big pop culture resurgence. So it happens with technology in many ways. Like there's lots of projects to try to get people to be compassionate, which is different than empathy, or at least be able to see, understand, and acknowledge that other people are suffering. Um, but at one point, you end up with neuroscientists saying we need to look at all of these things people say are real. And so they start trying to figure out if empathy is real. And they're like, wait, there are mirror neurons. And we do that thing where it's like, we said mirror, this must be empathy. And I'm like, but wait, you're the one who assigned the name to this thing. This is what's happening. And like the mirror neurons do the physical empathy thing where when somebody yawns, you yawn. So that is a form of empathy. But they don't do the emotional thing. The emotional thing is like it's play. It's performative. You have early performance theories when this is happening talking about like being able to take that on as like a form of play, the effective part. And honestly, the empathy as it was supposed to come over wasn't even supposed to be about effectives. It was really supposed to be a perspective taking, understanding that there's an aesthetic object thing happening. But we turned it into it's just like, no, we can do this beautiful thing where if we really open ourselves up and we really listen to people suffering, just suffering, then we will somehow be better. Then we will really get them because God forbid anybody imagine themselves outside of a suffering framework. And we erase the role of binaries, we erase bias, we erase all of these things that happen when we encounter each other and say, none of that matters because somehow in my brain, I have the entire universe of every human.
Yeah.
And I am somehow magical and big enough and experienced enough that there are no limits between me and you. And I know that we can't find it in the brain, but I'm going to accept that this is how it should be. And the reason it became so important to me is with technology, especially with like posthumanism, it's all about feeling into objects again, but not feeling into objects as though they're objects. It's feeling into objects as though objects have feelings like they're human.
Yep.
That's so weird. And then all this weird technology stuff happens, all the social media stuff happens. And I read critiques even from academics who I think are wonderful. And you get to the part of the end of their books are the parts where they're talking about the solution. And it's always more empathy. And I'm like, we haven't critiqued empathy. Like, this is just something that was made up less than 200 years ago. We keep looking to the past and saying all this empathy stuff was happening. That's not what was happening. We should maybe look at the words that we're using and look at the words that were used at the time and look at like the diversity of experiences that we're flattening by saying that people have always existed in this way. And also, even if it is real, and this is one of the things that drives me crazy, people assume that humans are inherently good. And I say crazy as in like it's one of those things that actually breaks my brain. That there is this assumption, like we buy into humans are altruistic, good beings who want things to be better as the planet burns down.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think that even if empathy is real, there will be people who will consume suffering and say, I did a really good job making that person suffer. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that people might have interior thoughts like that. And the stance that I always take is like, I don't need to know why somebody would want me dead just for being me. I need them to not kill me. And if we can walk past each other in the street, we don't need to know each other's brain on the inside. We just need to be okay humans to each other. And so empathy culture and like the history of empathy attempts to pretend as though we are all trying to make everything better at all times. And that is a collective goal.
Mhm.
But there's nothing historically that supports that as a reality, at least not that I've found.
I'm so struck thinking about this sort of historical trajectory that you're narrating, how particularly since the post Second World War era and from the 50s and 60s onward specifically, that there's something about these features, whether it be this implicit philosophy of universality, like everyone has certain basic experiences and we can relate to them, to this idea that communication can be perfectly transparent, that feeling something is like the highest mode of some sort of self-actualization, even as opposed to changing or doing anything. And even the way in which that all gets just packaged as a series of like transactions or ticks or commodities or whatever you want to call it, gestures even. It seems in a very overdetermined way, and in a way that I'm speaking on the level of necessity and not on the level of like conspiratorial theory. Though, of course, I think Carl Rogers worked for the CIA in the 50s and all that shit. But like
Yeah.
Human Ecology Project, people can Google. It feels very much like an ideology. There's a distinctive kind of like Americanness to it, or at least it seems to suggest a lot of the narratives or hubristic dispositions of a victorious West, and specifically of like people in an imperial core, but they don't want to think about themselves as being in an empire, right? They don't want to think about themselves as having power collectively or power individually. They simply want to see themselves as ratifying the natural market order and as, connecting with other people, and just simply connecting with someone is enough to bridge any of the gaps that are actually rapidly emerging in this globalizing but also decolonizing world. And there's something about that seems just in that historical moment, and here I think 60s, 70s and whatnot, that you can imagine how much more attractive that would be to people who don't want to have to, I don't know, like deal with a figure like Fanon, who can be like, well, there's some things about me you can't understand.
Right.
And also I recognize you, but I may want to kill you because of the things that you structurally do. And I'll feel bad about that. And then I'll have damage for me. But actual antagonisms and gulfs of feelings are anathema to a sort of like a Cold War liberal order that sees itself as just increasing transparency at every possible level. And I wonder if maybe there's a kind of, to bring it up to the present, there's a kind of like a reprise or a shift, or some sort of like, I'm not sure, I can't quite put the words to it, but in this digital moment, right, that it's the thing about the dispersion of that impulse also seems to reflect certain underlying political, economic sort of senses of boundaries or alterity and stuff.
Yeah. Well, can I just piggyback on that for just one second and say, like, part of what you're making me think of and is also, it seems to me like the imperative to empathy in the book, wherever it comes from, it's fundamentally like a colonial one, and we're seeing that reproduced in these digital contexts as well. Yeah,
We are. It's also a very weird point in colonial history, which is obviously very long and empires are long-standing. But it's tied to advances in technologies of representation. But Patrick, you mentioned the Cold War. It's also coming out at a point where everybody around the planet at any moment is suddenly scared of a nuclear bomb dropping where they live. And so there are all these moments where there's potential collective death and annihilation of humans, where it's like, we need to think about how each other feels. And when you look at the changes that happen because of digital technology, it's a similar moment where suddenly there's access to all this information and all these people that we shouldn't have access to before. And we know some of it's going to be harmful. We know we know that child pornography runs the internet in many ways, and it did early on. But we don't want to acknowledge that that's the thing that is happening, that there's a dark web, that people are doing bad things. They're connecting to bad places that they wouldn't have access to otherwise. People could have their grossest, sickest thought and put it into a search engine or a forum and find a whole group of people that suddenly are willing to go down this pathway with them. We know that we need moderation really early on, and there's still a crisis of moderation that's causing people to have psychological collapses because humans are not inherently good in the way that we want us to be. So we see empathy come back in this moment in such a strong way in partnership with advances in understanding neurodivergency, where we say, this will explain everything that's wrong with every human ever. And if you practice this, you won't have any of these problems. And that just feels really unrealistic. But again, it seems to bubble up at points where there is a fear of a very specific type of cultural collapse. So even at the point where it's becoming a prominent thing in the late 1800s, colonization is doing weird stuff by then.
Yeah.
On the precipice of the First World War. Things are changing. There are advances in technology. We need to think about how we feel about things. We have World War II. Let's think about how we feel about things. Look, we can access all of these people through television. How do we feel about them? Okay, now we have digital stuff. Oh no, there are so many more people. And we keep coming back to this. But when we say, how do we feel about them? We don't want to say that because we might say the bad thing, which is they are different. I don't trust them. So instead, we say, look at how they're suffering. You understand
Right.
suffering. Let's eat their suffering and we will be better and get them. If we just sit and talk to them and have them tell us about how they suffered, they will suddenly be human. And then when somebody shows up, if they aren't suffering properly, they are bad. And that's the empathy culture dynamic that I think I try to work through in the book in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think like the sort of example that you have in the book of the like, here are these people, how do we feel about them, is the human zoo.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that phenomenon and also about some of its contemporary equivalents. And in this connection, I wanted to read to our listeners a passage which I read the book a little bit before Patrick did, and I sent him this quotation because I was like, oh, okay, like, I want to remember this, engrave it on your heart. Like this is one of those things. So now this is me quoting Jade. The horrors of the past can be judged by today's moral standards. We must judge. We must judge because the horrors of the past are today's moral standard. And it's just such a deft intervention, not only in the phenomenon of human zoos, but in so many just deadlocked conversations. It hits so hard.
So I think human zoos are fascinating. Like I said, I wasn't able to see myself reflected in scholarship until I was introduced to human zoos. And then I was really disturbed at how quickly the conversation just turned to look at how these people were suffering. And that's sort of been the only story I've ever heard about human zoos. I happened to go to undergrad in Hawaii, as you mentioned. They have this wonderful place called the Polynesian Cultural Center, which is still active. It's owned by the Mormon Church, and I talk about my experience there in the book because it was sort of this before I had the language of human zoos, I had been to one. And I had been reprimanded by people who were performers in the space for not letting them practice English, which is one of the reasons they were there. Because my grandfather insisted on me speaking to the people from Tahiti in French. And they got so disgusted with me. And I was like, they're right. They're right. They are here to learn English. And it was a weird experience because It's a place where they bus in tourists from Waikiki all the way back to the Polynesian Cultural Center. It's an all-day thing. It ends with a dinner. And they do all of these shows that are the same as human zoos have always been. I talk about a couple of museum shows from ethnology museums that previously housed human zoos. And the shows are exactly the same ones at the Polynesian Cultural Center. But one of my joys is the points where I get uncomfortable. I'm like, wait, what is happening? Why am I reacting this way to what's going on? So it's something that always sort of stuck with me. And I've been obsessed with human zoos ever since, partially because I also had a very early reality TV addiction with the real world, and continue to have it. It's another space where I'm just like, I actually like watching people do weird stuff in contrived situations. It makes me really happy. So I ended up looking at the history of the Polynesian Cultural Center in the book. Turns out it has really great intentions. The Mormon church, I know people have lots of bad feelings about them. I married somebody from an old Mormon family, so I should just disclose that. And I went to high school in a very Mormon town because I have this weird outside of religion thing happening throughout my entire life. But the Mormon church started this university in Hawaii to attract students from the Polynesian countries. And the students were coming and they were trying to be good Mormons, and they realized that they were having this psychological break in some ways, the way that it's described, similar to how Fanon talks about people getting pulled out of culture,
Yeah.
where it was breaking them. And they needed to give them a space where they could celebrate who they were. And also, it would pay for them to go to school and allow them to practice English and talk with a diverse group of people that they wouldn't have access to otherwise because they're at this small town college in Hawaii. And so they created the Polynesian Cultural Center to remind them of the beauty of their cultures. And they set up these little villages for them to do that. And they earn their tuition there. And it's great. And then the church uses it as a way to try to get you to convert to Mormonism. And then you can go see the temple and do all that fun stuff and watch an informational video if you're into that. And they have missionary houses too. So they actually have Mormon missionaries who are active missionaries on site. So you get this really weird experience that has so many levels of meaning, but on the surface, does that horrible binary that we have with human zoos where we look at the performers and say, they're being oppressed. How dare they participate in this? This is bad. They should feel bad about the thing that they're doing to make their life better. And when we look historically at human zoos, which some of them documented the people very well, and you'll see images in the book that get reproduced a lot because there was a group of, and this is the part where I say the word that is an offensive word, but we need to say the word because it's still how you find it. The Hottentot people were brought to Paris numerous times after Saartjie Baartman. And in 1888, a whole group that was heavily photographed. They were part of a medical conference where they wrote and said, this thing isn't real. This is actually a whole bunch of tribes that are different people. They were interviewed. There was a whole publicity campaign about them being there. There are stories about them being out on the town in Paris. One of the things that I couldn't put in the book is that at the Folies Bergère, which everybody has heard about, during this period, there are these half Khoi dancers who are part of that group. So there's just this whole other world that was happening where people are literally just trying to have experience and make a living. And for some people, it's temporary, but for some people, it's permanent. But because we reduce the experience of so many groups in Europe to human zoos, and we make them the thing that was horrible instead of like Hagenbeck, who I talk about in the book,
Right.
who was the German guy who started this, who was like the famous animal catcher, whose biography is titled Of Beast and Men. He's the one who starts human zoos because he's losing money with his animals. Nobody cares anymore. And he's like, I will just bring people and this will be great. And there are lots of horrible stories about him. But we allow that horror and that horrible impulse of the really bad stories. So it's the Saartjie Baartmans. It's the family from Canada, the Indigenous family that died in Germany. It is the man who was in the Bronx who committed suicide. We allow that to be the story of the human zoo instead of judging people like Hagenbeck who create these experiences that are designed to exploit and oppress and make terrible things happen. And we say that the people who choose to participate in these, especially when they have limited options, they are bad. They're the bad ones. We don't say it explicitly, but they are who we envision when we envision what the oppression is and what the bad thing is. And we don't allow them to say, this part was horrible. This part was actually really great. And it changed my life and gave me these experiences I wouldn't have had otherwise. Or, the other thing that happens with a lot of these people is I was converted. I was told this is where the church is. I wanted to be closer to that to experience it. So I knew because I had this new relationship with God. And so I went. Like there are reasons people join human zoos. And they're normal reasons. They're everyday life reasons. One of the guys, I think everybody should learn about Prince Roland Napoleon Bonaparte. He produced a lot of the images that are in the book. He commissioned a lot of them. He wrote one book when he went to Suriname to get people to go to join a World's Fair human zoo type thing. And it's the only book that he's written. And at one point he talks about how the Black people in Suriname are like, the white people are a mess. And he's like, I think they are right. I'm having so much more fun working with them, and this is what they're getting out of it. And I often, when I mention him in the book, because I'm sort of fascinated and I wish that he had written more, because his daughter ends up being the one who saves Freud from Germany. And sort of, right. Like they are this family of weird activists who are like, this is going to have a bigger impact than this thing. And so for me, having access to his book and knowing the bad language so that I can find the photographs, it's like, I know from his writing and from the work that his daughter did, probably they were thinking longer term. It's important that this is documented because this will mean something more later on, even if people don't know that now. And you see that as sort of a theme in that work. But we only get like the big guy who still has a zoo named after him. He is the only version we get to move forward. And we don't get to talk about the other side that said we are increasingly becoming more and more global. Let's make sure that we have something for people to know that these people existed and they were whole people later on.
One of the things that the book made me reflect on a lot, and this is partly because you're doing it, you're thematizing it, but also you're so self-consciously reflecting on like your choice to include or not include different images. You're talking at the very beginning about the subtitle should be "This book will make you uncomfortable," and you're like, I'm being uncomfortable. Like, it's really, it's searching, it's self-searching. It made me think very much about some of my own discomforts. Like I teach gender studies as well as philosophy, and I always have discomfort when I'm projecting any image. This was like very clarifying in some ways, but I do think that maybe we can kind of like zoom forward in time and think a little bit about the ways in which your critique of empathy indicts us in the ways that, or not just indicts us, but makes us think about how we do interact with still images, with videos, whether as scholars or just whether as people. I think there's something about at the moment when we as scholars often feel the most self-congratulatory about how we are not only working with, but also teaching images. Those are the moments when we actually need to be the most self-critical. And I think that there are lessons in this book, not just for those of us who work with those sorts of images professionally, but for all of us.
Yeah. So I tend to, the part that I don't say about my academic training, because people are like, what does that even have to do with anything? Is performance studies was a big part of it as well.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that was really important for me with performance studies that I think is in any work that I do is the role of reflexivity.
Yeah.
Versus reflection, which is really thinking about what am I doing by being in this space? What am I bringing? What perspective do I have and how is that going to shape what I do? And how much of that does the audience need to know? And my stance is they need to know as much as possible because these are the limits of what I'm going to be able to uncover or think about or understand with this thing. And for me, that's really important because for me, scholarship is like being able to sit with your curiosity and hopefully have other people join the party who can illuminate something else. And so there are parts in the book where I'm like, I'm working with these images because I think they're important. And also, I'm trying to reunite people with names because these images get reproduced and we don't know their names, but their names are recorded in other places and we can bring them together.
Yeah.
I could care less about the book in some ways, but having that part where people's interviews, photographs, and names can be back together and potentially make it to their families, which was one of the things that was modeled in one of the books that I talk about in the book called From Samoa with Love, which was part of one of those ethnology museum shows, is the minimum amount of work that was important to do in this book for me. And the reflexive part is I am a Black American woman who's looking at images that look familiar to me because they are Black women, but they have nothing to do with me. But they have something to do with somebody out there who might say, let me look at this book. They might flip through it and they might see some of the pictures and go, actually, I know who this person is. Oh, wow, I didn't know that they had interviews. This name is wrong. And hopefully that becomes a jumping off point for somebody else's work from their perspective to say, actually, there's more. Actually, this is wrong. Actually, we can have a more nuanced understanding, which is sort of the opposite of what we do in scholarship a lot, where we try to find that one perfect image that can capture all of the ideas.
Yeah.
Which is, again, it's that flattening thing that empathy does, where it's like we know that we are going to have a certain reaction to visual media in a particular way. Oftentimes, when people talk about having empathetic experiences with media reproductions of people, they will always be like, especially with VR, it drives me crazy. Because all of these things, again, they actually break my brain. They say, I know it worked. I'm like, how? I cried. I'm like, what? What? I was like, how is that the barometer of this having been meaningful? I'm like, okay, so I am the type of person from childhood who's laughed when people get hurt reflexively. I can't stop myself from doing it. It causes lots of misunderstandings, always has. I cry when I'm angry. I am very quiet and murderous when I'm sad.
Nice.
And I will also cry if I'm having a moment of great joy and understanding with somebody and I feel like I'm having a deep connection. But I definitely don't cry at these points where other people are crying. I don't think that I'm broken, but I should be reflexive about that. What is it about me that's making me react this way? And what is it about you that made you react? Are we actually doing these things that we think that we're doing? And I think that when we select images, especially for things that are difficult to try to illustrate those things, we predetermine so much. And we often do it without doing a deep dive into what's actually happening in the image
Yeah.
and what's happening outside of the image. Because we tend to use them or look at them or share them at points when we're like, I don't feel like trying to make all of this make sense. Here, have this mediated experience. We're done.
And the fact that that mediated experience, what is actually, as you extensively documented, a really mediated experience is culturally thematized and even understood, experienced by people as being actually unmediated, seems like the core of the trap. And I think about one line you have here. It's like empathy is a cultural tool designed to assuage potential unmediated cultural guilt when the impression of the past collides with the present, or when people imagined as outside of the present become visible. Which, yeah, that took my breath away. I can see it taking Dan's breath away
Dan
right
is
now.
making
Dan
a
and Lisa's
face.
that idea of thinking about empathy as itself a technology, right? It's this thing that's supposedly, we're reaching to the language of neurons and what primates do and all this shit, just basically to naturalize and give a false history to this sort of like tool. And I think so much about this. I mean, as you've written, and we'll share some links to this as well in your other writing, but about the way in which on social media there's the impulse in particular to like share horrible images of things or like to like quote unquote raise awareness.
Yep.
What that does is it either well, it personalizes things inside. It does so many things, right? It's like, well, I can handle this. I'm throwing this at you. And then, but if the person's seen it a million times, like you're presuming that the person that's witnessing, generally the transactions that I've seen most are the most horrible in this way. It's like some white person shares a picture of a police killing of a person of color. And like, I'm doing this to raise awareness. And as though there weren't a million other signs that this happens constantly, or a million other previous instances in which that, like, it's, and of course that also excludes the other audiences for whom will have a very different, they have to live with that awareness every single day, as opposed to like just simply encountering this mediated form. And so it flattens in so many different directions in terms of temporality, in terms of self-other distinctions, but also like the way it centers this experience of like a brief moment of like breaking the stress cycle, a brief emotional release, and then you move on.
Yeah. In
the part of the spectator, it reminds me of, like, to use another sort of moralizing but also like affective rhetoric, like it's the danger of pity, right? It's for one brief moment, instead of you feel pity for someone, and that means that you somehow can move on. Yeah, and to have this moment of like pity in the context of a social and political order that is actually pitiless and merciless at every possible level it's a real twisted thing. I don't want to reach for the satanic here, but I will say that bit, the other thing, I'm sorry, but like that example that you give from the MIT Media Lab partnering with UNICEF to like do the like, are the images of these traumatized children, which one makes you feel more like tap your empathy more? And I was just reading this, and I was a little vein was popping in my head, and I'm wondering, is this during the period of time when like Joy Ito is taking money from Jeffrey Epstein to like do MIT Media Lab shit?
Yeah,
Like exactly.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Great. That's really cool.
Yeah, it was during active wartime too, so it was while the conflict was still ongoing. I think the easy way of saying what all this is we have the lovely cliche phrase, seeing is believing. And so we think that we need to see. And the thing that I find really interesting about it is this, just so everybody's aware, part of my work is multi-generational trauma. And that is one of the ways that Patrick and I were able to connect. And one of the first things that you learn when you're studying trauma is it's defined by having an event that is incomprehensible, that then returns in unexpected ways later on. And what empathy does is it's this weird acknowledgement that trauma is real, but it's not real because the event has to be stable and it has to be set. And that is sort of like the opposite of what it actually is. Like the event is a crisis point. Nothing is making sense. Things are upside down. It's the thing that you don't get to go back to that's actually tearing apart your understanding of yourself and the world. And yes, we have ways of capturing that moment and describing that thing that was captured. But by doing empathy, by creating these projects where we're like, this is the point, this is the image, this is what it looks like, this is how we talk about it. We don't allow for that part of processing that is the recurrence to be real, because the person has to keep going back to describing that thing that people can see so they believe it. Because if you try to talk about the traumatic event, I had to stop listening to Radiolab. I used to love Radiolab, but they talked about people talking about what was happening in Vietnam. And they kept trying to convince people that things that they experienced didn't happen. And there's all this research and blah, 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 blah. And a couple of weeks later, they were talking about stuff that was suddenly available in the British archives, that all this stuff people were talking about, this actually did happen. We just didn't know before. And we don't allow for those major, huge traumatic things that are systemic. And I would say extrajudicial killings of people of color on video is one of those things that is like that. We don't allow for people to talk about what that experience is because we need it to be contained. And it is, by definition, something that cannot be, because it is something that cannot exist and allow somebody to feel like they are able to live their life. But media and the mediated experience allows it to do that thing. And so that's the thing that we end up describing. And that's the thing that we end up walking onto, because that is the thing that we get to see and that we get to believe. And when we enter into scholarship, especially if we're working with archives, we do the same thing where we're just like, this is the body. This is the whole thing. I have the whole thing. This is absolutely it. My answers are here. And we don't stop and go, oh, wait, this can't be everything. What am I missing? And what are the whispers that might be in this space that people could have missed that I might be able to uncover if I spend a bit more time with my one object and sort of try to piece together what I can from it and acknowledge, hey, I'm just picking up crumbs. I don't know what the heck is going on. But this part is actually really important because it's helping me understand this aspect of my question, my humanity, myself as a researcher or a society or trauma or all of these things a bit better. And I think that's so important because the other part of having those objects that then become the stand in for the actual event is that I think the big break that happens with empathy overall is we can't actually talk about our own suffering. Because when you talk about the empathetic experience, you're supposed to be not talking about yourself.
Right.
You're supposed to be getting closer to this other person who, by nature of the events we often choose to have empathy around, don't even have access to that themselves. And so it's all very broken. So I think that's probably what you all are reacting to because again, empathy is this huge unifying ideology object
Mhm.
that says, we'll contain it. It's fine. We've got it. Here is the photograph. Here is the video. Here is the VR experience. We are good. Step in, step out. Let's move on.
Right. I wonder if we can talk a little bit about some of the things that come up when you think about the title, right? It's the other side of empathy, which is certainly about like the dark side of empathy, but it's also about, the question of whether we can traverse it.
Yeah. That's interesting. That's not what I meant when I wrote the title. I'm glad that it means that. It means that the book works.
So that's good. That's good. I guess I was hearing it as like first like the others like we normally think it's this like, sunshine and puppies and empathy, right? And then that you are trying to say like we have to traverse this to like get to the other side. I thought both of these things were there. But I'm happy to be
All
wrong.
of these things are there.
Okay.
All of those things are there. No, I think that they are. For me, the title was the people. Like the other side of empathy is people. It's not feelings. It's that there's actually a person there.
Mhm.
So for me, I don't know that it had that level of weight, though the way that I was thinking of the book as I was working on it probably had that intention. And by that, I mean, I'm not a linear thinker and I hate time. So everybody's aware. I think it breaks lots of things. So conceptually, when I was thinking of the book, looking at historical examples of human zoos and then moving to technology, there's a breakage point for me where the book is in half. So one half is looking at the past and one half is looking
Right.
at the present. And they sort of get folded into one book
Mhm.
in a way that there is a breakage. I don't do a good job of linking the two sides. But I think that's sort of the breakdown of empathy. And that's sort of what the book is trying to capture. The other side is always the other person,
Mhm.
the person who has the firsthand experience. But there's another other side, and that is who am I actually if this is my only way of connecting to people?
Yeah. I wanted to read a passage to our listeners getting at this sort of if we don't allow ourselves to just sort of like, tarry with empathy or just like be subsumed by empathy culture, like what other affects might we not necessarily replace empathy with, but at least start to, I don't know, think with is the wrong phrase there, to feel with. But so here's the passage I wanted to read. I do not have an answer to how we might replace empathy, other than that an affect suitable to the task of decolonization must start with radical love of the self and the other. What I do have are thoughts in the temporality bound in colonial ideas of goodness and badness, of missions and almost humans, where we might imagine what might become if we replace empathy with mutual recognition, action, and perhaps compassion. Without compassion based on a radical transcendent self-love, to let go of empathy does not stop the self-alienation and annihilation so central to colonial thinking and designed to launch people into a psycho-existential crisis that requires the other, so the self can be defined and valued. Okay, close quote. So I wanted to ask a bit about those sort of possibilities you gesture at in terms of, ways in which we might be able to extricate ourselves from the trap of empathy. Not that that is going to be, an easy or a guilt-free proposition, right?
Oh, it should be full of guilt.
Full
It
of
should be
guilt,
full of
chock
guilt.
full
Guilt
of
is good.
guilt. Yeah.
So I will take this opportunity to say I did have a Buddhist teacher because I took a Buddhist communication class during the pandemic who stole some of my work from my zine, which I learned on social media because somebody showed us. Yeah, they showed a slide. We got in a big argument about empathy. But the zine actually starts with instead of empathy, use, and then it gives a bunch of words that we might use for affects or feelings that we're having, like recognition, understanding, confusion, fear, pity, comprehension, listening, all the words that we've been saying throughout this conversation, things that we can possibly do.
Yeah.
And so for me, the self love starts with acknowledging that everybody is complex. We are all full of contradictions. We are all trying to make sense of a world that's never going to make sense. And we don't have access to all experience, but we do have access to ourselves. And we know that we react to things. We should be able to acknowledge that this new thing that I'm experiencing, or this new person I'm experiencing, or this new food I'm experiencing makes me really uncomfortable. We should look at people who are being oppressed, who are being suffered, who are feeling violence, and we should acknowledge that for some people, they'll be like, good. And for other people, they will be like, this is horrible. This shouldn't happen. This is making me angry. This is making me sad, depending on your proximity to the people that you are watching enduring different types of things. I think if we start there and say that this is a normal feeling you have, it is okay to have these feelings and thoughts, rather than saying, ignore your thoughts and feelings. Look at how they're suffering. Like, you have to start with saying, I'm just a whole person. I am a whole person who is complex, who can't make sense of things sometimes. And I react badly or I react great. But okay, why did I react that way? And then once you're able to do that, you're more likely to be open to listening to another person, because what the empathy impulse asks us to do is it asks us to tap down all of those internal dialogues we use to make sense of the world and replace them with somebody else's perceived suffering. And so I go to mutual recognition because that's what Fanon says that we need to do at the beginning of Black Skin, White Masks. It's we need to understand that man is a universal yes. We are the potential to say yes. We are the potential to change the world if only we acknowledge that we have that power. And the only way we do that is by understanding that we are in this together. We are going to make mistakes. We might even be horrible people, but we're making this up as we go and it can be different. And the only way it's different is if we listen to people, we accept that people are going to do bad things, we approach that with compassion, we don't internalize it. Like, absolutely don't internalize other people's stuff.
Right.
What are we doing together? And there will be affect involved. It's not that most important thing. Like, if things work better, then they work better. If we are making things better for the most vulnerable, we know that that usually it makes everything better for everybody else. But because we are constantly playing with the idea of moving suffering around and the idea that we have to center it somewhere, we don't allow that to move forward. And empathy forces us to sort of stay in that frame in a way that just saying suffering is a thing in the world. So is joy. So is hatred. So are all of these horrible things. This past weekend, I was like having an existential crisis because I was like, I really need to work on letting go of the hatred I have in my heart. It's been pretty rough. With everything that has happened over the summer with the burning of the trees, because I often think about why don't we extend empathy to the planet, because we know it's what gives us life, but we're breathing in all of this bad air. We don't even see how many trees are dying because those things are dying too. We need to all be able to sit with those feelings that we have. And we should feel guilt. I talk about transformative guilt in the book. Guilt is one of those emotions that is really neutral. It's only bad if you take guilt as self-judgment. And I think one of the things that I'm asking for is that we stop being so hard on ourselves. And we take those moments where we have the uncertainty, where we have the guilt, where we have the negative things and go, hey, what am I actually reacting to? And does it even matter? Because I think when we allow ourselves to do that, we go, okay, maybe it mattered. And maybe I have a couple of apologies I need to give, or maybe I need to change my approach. But that is work I need to do by myself. And I'm worth doing that because I love myself enough to know that I can do better than this thing that made me feel that way.
There's such wisdom in what you're saying, and I think this is going to be one of those episodes that I go back and listen to kind of let it sink in, because I have a certain negative bias where I like have a very hard time hearing the injunctions. It's perhaps TMI, but I have a certain doing like what I guess sometimes is called positive self-talk, or even internalizing good feedback, or like just thinking about the idea of thinking good about myself is like it goes through all these difficult things, right? Like it's very hard.
Yeah.
But I think here about something that is a reaction that I had to when I first saw your talk, actually, on the Human Zoos thing several years ago now, and but also that has been gestating, and that I kept processing because of you, but that also sort of interfaces with some long-standing intellectual and affective and personal preoccupations, and something we've talked about elsewhere on the podcast. But like that kind of error that one can fall into of thinking that just because something is awful or painful, it must necessarily be the most true, or like the most real, or just some of the most dispositive of, well, as you say, as you describe in the empathy book, of like what the other is, but also that redounds back on ourselves, right? And there's this way in which, like, and I think about some of my work, like consuming archival material about people doing horrible things to one another, and I start feeling like I am a member of this same horrible humanity, and I start beating myself up for being like, what am I even doing? There's no way in which, like, whereas what you were describing here via, I think, that the incredibly powerful and generative notion of mutual recognition is this kind of, but also through the practice that you're describing of looking for taking these documents not just as signs of trauma or like a proof of death, or even proof of life in the way the kidnapper asks you for it, but actually proof of having lived, proof of liveliness, proof of thriving in a way that's distinct from merely surviving or just being victimized. There's something about that is just a vital corrective against the tendency, call it depressive, call it ideological, call it just the way in which like doom scrolling works. I don't know. I think it's ramified in a whole lot of other ways, but to shuck off that commitment that just because something is bad, it must be the most true and the most real. And because that, again, just to repeat, I'm repeating what you're saying so much more clumsily, but just that it is a kind of violence, or at least a lack of a failure of love for the other and for the self at the same time.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that it does, just in terms of what technique is this technology performing, is it erases the role of agency that everybody has, even in the most dire situation. So even in life or death situation, there is a choice, there is a level of agency there. It might not be equal, it might be horrible, it might be an absolutely impossible choice. But in that moment, it's sort of like the Mr. Rogers, like, look for the helpers. It's like, look for the agency. Where did people have agency? Where were they making choices? Where did they have control over what was happening to them? Do we know why they made these choices to help us understand it better? So we can say, oh, wait, there is actually some agency at play here. It sort of shifts how we understand suffering in a way that I think is really good. And I think that the negative thing, as far as I've been able to see in my research and talking to the many people I've talked to who have expertise in actual practice of mental health, humans are wired for negativity. It's like how we survive.
Right.
So, like, to try to run away from that as sort of a fundamental thing that has existed within us across millennia so that we could live, it seems really weird. Like, what? Why are we trying to do this? Like, can we just talk about how hot it is now? Where is my snow? Why are my allergies lasting so long? Those are all really horrible things that I want to talk about. The bigger picture is, hey, maybe collectively we should not want to be this hot and have allergies for this long because this is not suffering we necessarily have to endure. We do have agency, but like, are we actually going to do it? Not if we keep focusing on empathy and understanding suffering as though people can't make choices. Or the only choice we can make is to understand somebody else's suffering, to understand that there are people who have it worse. Which is like one of those other 80s cliches where they're like, you aren't finishing your food. There are starving kids wherever in the world. And it's like, okay, but this food is nasty. I am choosing to starve in this moment because I don't want to eat this. And that's sort of, I think, what I'm calling for in a more lighthearted way. But yeah, acknowledge the negative thoughts. Let's do it.
Jade, this has been such a delight to talk to you and to think with you. You know, the book is it's gonna just kind of keep churning around in my head. I wonder if besides the book, are there other places that our listeners can read you or see you?
There is stuff online. Right now, I'm in a bit of a transition period with work, so I don't have any planned talks at this time, but I am open to those. I do theoretically, supposedly have an article coming out soon on paranoia and empathy, where I say that paranoia is sort of the binary of the fantastic suffering. One side says I have to understand the suffering of the other to be a better person, and that will make me good. And I think for me, paranoia is the part where I tried, I really tried to understand the suffering. I could not do it. This is real scary. They must be real mad because this was horrible. So I'm hoping that that is out by the end of the year. So be on the lookout for that.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Jade Davis. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.